Hi everyone, welcome back to the Hormones in Harmony podcast. Today I'm joined by my guest Kaely McDevitt to talk all about ovulation. So what it is, how to support it, signs and symptoms. For those listening to previous episodes, I talk all the time about progesterone health and how progesterone is like the anti-anxiety, anti-PMS hormone. So in order to produce progesterone, we need to ovulate. So that's what we're going to be talking about in much more detail today. So Kaely McDevitt is a registered dietitian specializing in women's health. She owns a virtual private practice where she and her team help their clients to overcome hormone and digestive issues through personalized nutrition. Having experienced the pitfalls of a conventional approach to women's health firsthand, Kaely is passionate about empowering women to take the driver's seat of their health and well-being. So that sounds very much like we're on the same page, Kaely. And I would love for you to start off by telling us a little bit more about your health journey and why you decided to train to become a registered dietitian.
Sure. And thanks so much for having me. My original interests in this field of nutrition were totally different than what I do now. I grew up like always being an athlete through like childhood and high school, and was always interested by sports nutrition. Like I had some sort of a ritual around what I would eat before games, and it would make me feel really well when I prepared that correctly. And that just really interested me. And I thought, okay, cool. Like nutrition had an impact on my performance. I find that very interesting to have experienced it firsthand. So I went into school thinking sports nutrition was what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with athletes, high performance, like even if they weren't athletes, like kind of weekend warriors. I was like, that's what I want to do. And at the same time, I went on birth control very early on, like probably within a few months of ever getting my period, because they were like atrocious, like so heavy, so painful. I was missing days of school. I went and saw my doctor and she was like, hey, we have this great solution for you to solve this problem. Here's birth control. And I was like, sign me up because I'm miserable. And so I, didn't look at any information. I didn't seek it out. It wasn't presented to me, but I took it. It solved my, temporary issue of terrible periods. But I started to feel less and less like myself over time. And I was developing a lot of anxiety and mood issues. My energy was in the tank. The way that I performed, even in the sports that I really enjoyed, changed. And I remember voicing that concern to various practitioners over the years, and it was largely dismissed. I tried pretty much every pill variety of birth control there was, thinking I'd find one that was like a good fit for me. And this is all on top of being in school to become a dietitian and desperately applying what I was being taught and not having it make any impact on how I felt. So I finished up schooling to become a dietitian. I took the board exam to get my RD, and I felt the least healthy I had ever been, and very much like a fraud, because I was like, God, here I am. I'm supposed to be a health expert and I can't help myself. And so I decided to come off birth control and see what that would be like. Spiraled into a lot of post-birth control syndrome stuff that, I'm happy to go into, but it was just a lot of low progesterone symptoms ultimately, because that's typically what happens post-birth control. So the anxiety was there, the skin health was a problem, hair loss. But I dug into the research that was out there, really changed a lot of my perspective around women's health and nutrition, and ended up getting back to feeling like myself. And it was kind of a long journey because there really weren't many resources around, and certainly nobody talking about that stuff at the time. So I started a blog and was sharing that experience. And I was like, it's probably just my mom and like a friend that's reading this. And then I started to hear from a lot of women that were dealing with the same stuff. And I, looked around at the end of my own health struggles and realized there were a lot of women that were looking for this info. And I just decided like, I probably should change directions with my career, because I no longer align with, what I was being taught and what I was doing before. And there's such a need here. So I had a major pivot and dove into women's health and haven't looked back since. And I really, really love it.
I'm sure many women listening can relate, and I certainly can, to the experience on birth control. I know definitely want to talk about like what's happening whilst we're on the pill or any hormonal contraceptives, and what happens afterwards, like how to support that process. But I first want to ask, in the UK, like dietitians and nutritionists are pretty different. And I know like a lot of registered dietitians in the US have this more holistic perspective. But how do you get trained? Is it more on like counting calories and grams of fat and managing disease? And have you had to do extra training to kind of know what you know now?
Yeah, so it's still very conventional training. And most of it is clinical. So you do a year-long internship of supervised practice in a clinical setting, almost exclusively. Sometimes you'll have some rotations out of that norm. And that's very much medical nutrition therapy. So working on specific disease states, very much preaching in accordance with like the general government health guidelines and some pretty outdated, food pyramid and my plate, like pretty outdated stuff. The foundational information in like human physiology and biology and biochemistry and all of that, I think was absolutely essential to understand metabolism and how the body works. But my views around nutrition and optimal health have certainly evolved since those days. And most of that was learned post school and post training, just kind of on the job. I had a lot of really interesting jobs right out of school that exposed me to the world of functional medicine. And I'm very thankful for that experience because it was totally eye-opening at the time.
And I've had the same thing, even though I did study to be a nutritional therapist, and it was very like naturopathic, holistic, functional medicine based. I left college thinking that I knew everything. Like, oh, this is so great. I'm so clever. And then you get started with clients and you're like, oh my God, I know nothing. And
exactly.
Podcasts and webinars and client experience that has given me the most education, honestly. So a lot of people, like the podcast that I do, a lot of people honestly know more about period health and birth control and things than conventional doctors, which is very scary to think like the general layperson has this kind of knowledge, but it's also amazing at the same time.
Yeah, no, I love it. The interest in these topics has just exploded over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, it's because it's so needed. And it's not that conventional doctors are trying to harm us in any way, they're just trying to help. And what they know and have been taught is that the birth control is kind of the miracle cure for any symptom that women are dealing with. But what's actually happening when we're taking that pill? Because I remember when I was given it, I was told that it was going to help clear my skin and stop my hair loss and regulate my cycle that had been missing because I was at the time over-exercising, not eating enough, and had lost my period due to amenorrhea. But they can sometimes tell you risk factors, like there's a slight increased risk of blood clots, breast cancer. I wasn't even told any of that. But when you look at the pill inserts in the box, it's like a huge, it's like the size of a football field when you lay it out. But I think women should know like what's actually happening, because if they choose to go ahead with it, that's fine. But they should be aware like what's physiologically happening to their body.
For sure. And I do want to preface this by saying I'm not inherently anti-birth control. I think that there's a time and place, and really it's up to the individual, not for me or you or anybody else to decide, but it is a lack of information that I have a problem with. And I think that there's a lot of overreaching when we talk about what it's described to be able to do. Like you said, it'll regulate your cycle. It will solve those symptoms. That's what was told to me. And at the most simplistic view of what hormonal birth control does is it's literally just shutting off ovulation, because if we don't ovulate, and I know we'll get into that specifically, we can't conceive. And that's really how it worked as a pregnancy prevention tool, is we just shut off ovulation so that there's no chance of conception, or very little chance of conception. I shouldn't say no, because it's not 100%. But when we do that, we shut off our own hormone production. So we don't benefit from the very helpful, natural, beautiful things that estrogen and progesterone especially do for us. And then to add insult to injury, we have synthetic hormones delivered by the pill or whatever hormonal contraceptive device you're using that have some negative health implications. So we don't get our own hormones, and we're dealing with the issues that come with fake hormones.
And they tell us that they often say it contains progesterone, but it's not progesterone, is it? It's progestin, which can have pretty much the opposite effects of everything amazing that progesterone does.
Yep.
And so what should be happening in a healthy menstrual cycle? So someone who's not on birth control, because if they are, this won't be happening. The natural hormones are just kind of on shutdown, and then they're running off this kind of same level of hormones until they take the pill bleed at the sugar pills, and then they have it's not a real period, it's just a withdrawal bleed, the drug. But a healthy cycle, like how should it go?
Yes. So this is something that I swear I did not know. I did not understand this at all when I was going through my health journey. And I was like, how is it possible that I just went through all of this school in a health profession and didn't learn this? So I'll get off my soapbox with that, but I hope that changes. So a normal menstrual cycle, we'll start with the basics. So day 1 of a menstrual cycle is the start of your period, just so everyone knows how we're counting. So day 1 of bleeding is considered day 1 of your cycle. And the first half of your menstrual cycle, roughly 14 days, is considered the follicular phase. And it's called that because we're actually developing and maturing a follicle in the ovaries that's going to have the egg that gets released at ovulation. So during that follicular phase, this follicle is maturing. We're getting ready for what's really the main event of the whole menstrual cycle, ovulation, which is right in the middle, typically around 14 days, although that's not exact for every female. And at ovulation, that egg is released. And this is when we have an opportunity for conception, if that's the goal. And if pregnancy is not the goal, this is when we need to make sure that we've got some protection or abstinence going on around this window. It's about a 5-day window of fertility in the middle of the cycle. And after ovulation, we enter what's called the luteal phase. And this is called that because the follicle that releases the egg at ovulation actually becomes a gland called the corpus luteum. So luteal phase, and it makes 100% of the progesterone that you'll make for that cycle. So the second half of the cycle in the luteal phase, we've got a lot of progesterone hanging around, which is great because that either is going to hold a pregnancy, nurture a pregnancy, or if we are not pregnant and we're going to be heading toward our next period, progesterone works to keep estrogen in check. So we manage premenstrual symptoms essentially. And so then our menstrual cycle ends with the start of the next period. And then the whole thing repeats itself. And it's on average about 28 days, but anything from like 25 to 35 would be within the realm of normal. So it's okay if there's some fluctuation there.
And how would you describe a healthy bleed period, like the period itself?
Yeah. So your period really should almost sneak up on you. I know we were trained to dread our menstrual cycle, that it was going to be this horrible experience, and like the commercials are complaining about it. And I just remember having in my head this fear around having a period because I just heard everybody complaining about it. And it's so common to have very symptomatic periods, but that's very much not a normal thing. We're going to feel a little bit different mood-wise, typically leading into that part of the cycle, just because of natural shifts in hormones. But we shouldn't have debilitating mood swings. We shouldn't have migraine headaches at this time. We shouldn't have excessively heavy or clotty bleeds where we're going through excessive amounts of super tampons and pads. We shouldn't have extremely painful cramping. It really should be pretty mild, and anywhere from like 3 to 7 days of bleeding is pretty average for most females, and mild symptoms is what we should be expecting, if any at all.
I'm glad that you mentioned the whole like belief system around menstrual cycle health as well, because part of that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you believe something is going to happen and you've been told by your sisters, your mother, your grandparents that we all have debilitating periods, you're going to be like on the toilet cramping over, bleeding through your pants, then it probably is going to happen. But maybe there is some genetic like estrogen dominant type issue, or maybe the lifestyle habits have been passed down and you're just eating similar foods and using similar beauty products to your mum and sisters. Maybe that's why you all share this common thing, but definitely common, but absolutely not normal. And yeah, the conventional medical system as well isn't, they kind of just think that because it is so common, if they're not willing to take the birth control, there's really no other option. I was told, like, again, it's either the birth control or just see what happens, just wait and see. But because I wasn't getting any recommendations for stopping exercising so much, eat more food, kind of manage stress better, then it was obviously going to continue and get worse. So I jumped at the chance of fixing the issue for the birth control. I actually went for we call it a smear test, but you call it a pap smear the other day. And I realized after I booked it that I would have been ovulating around that time. So I saw the nurse practitioner there, and she was doing the smear test, and she couldn't see my cervix. And she was like, this is really weird. I was like, I'm ovulating, so it actually moves higher up. She was like, do you work like with women? I was like, yeah, I'm a practitioner. But she didn't know. She said some women it's really low down, easy to see. Some women you have to kind of lift my pelvis up a little bit so she could find it. But she didn't know it was related to ovulation. And same with because I was producing like cervical mucus at the time. We'll talk about these signs as well in a bit more detail. She was like, there's a lot of mucus here. I was like, yeah, it's like I'm ovulating. I'm just sad. She's like, yeah, is this normal for you? I was like, yeah, pretty healthy, good sign. But I was just like, this is so weird. She's working with women all day, every day, and she doesn't know these basic body signals.
Yep. I'm not surprised, but it is also very sad.
So these are, the mucus, the cervix position, I just give a little brief overview, but could you talk about that and the basal body temperature and how those three things can help you track ovulation?
Absolutely. So we've got, like you said, three main physical signs of ovulation. So as you get ready to ovulate, the cervical fluid or cervical mucus that you make actually changes in consistency to what's easiest or most well described as like egg white consistency, like pretty slippery and almost clear liquidy instead of thick, sticky or lotiony. And it does so, raw egg whites, not scrambled egg whites, raw egg white consistency.
That may be some sort of yeast infection.
Right. So raw egg whites is a sign that ovulation is imminent. So it's coming up. And that type of cervical fluid is actually what helps facilitate sperm traveling to the egg. So there's a whole reason for it. And it's associated with estrogen spiking around ovulation, which it should do. That's actually what's triggering the event. Your cervix actually changes position and even firmness around that time too. So instead of being low and hard, it's actually high, soft, and more open, again, to facilitate the sperm traveling to the egg. So if you did a self cervical exam where you are feeling that with the tips of your fingers, you would actually notice different position and different firmness at that time of the month. And then post ovulation, when we're making all of that beautiful progesterone, that actually causes your waking body temperature or basal body temperature to be a little bit higher. So by tracking those three things, we can really get good at pinpointing when ovulation occurred. So the cervical fluid and position are more like, hey, ovulation's about to happen. And basal body temperature spike is saying, hey, ovulation did happen.
And those three together, if someone wants to do more research, and I have some episodes on it, is known as the fertility awareness method, which isn't the same if you were to mention that to your doctor. Like, I'm not on birth control, I'm doing the fertility awareness method. They really think it's the rhythm method. So could you talk about what they potentially are thinking when you mention that, and why they don't recommend it, and why we don't recommend that?
Yes, it's unfortunate that fertility awareness method gets lumped in there with a bunch of other practices. So the rhythm method would be like just marking on a calendar when your period came and counting 14 days from there and saying, okay, that's ovulation. When we know that 14 days is not exact for every female, and it's likely to fluctuate a little bit month to month based on lifestyle, stress, nutrition. There's also like the moon method. People are just basing it off of moon cycles, which that is very fascinating to me, the relationship between the moon cycles and the menstrual cycle, but I certainly wouldn't rely on that for contraceptives. So there's a bunch of other, a lot less scientific practices lumped under the same umbrella. So when you say fertility awareness method, they think one of those two things, that less scientific, less fact or data driven, and more just like months on a calendar or related to the cycles of the moon, which are highly inaccurate. So you're going to have to explain what you're doing with cervical or with fertility awareness method. And that might be something that they've actually never heard of.
And fertility awareness has been probably used since the beginning of time to either prevent or promote pregnancy. So it's nothing new. It's just listening to our body's signals, and not just using an app. Even some of these period tracking apps, people are using that alone, which is resulting in unwanted pregnancies or not able to fall pregnant because they're not even timing intercourse at the correct part of the cycle, because the app's basing it on when their last period was.
Right.
And it's not based on when they're actually ovulating, because that can differ month to month.
And I think being trained in true fertility awareness method and actually doing that for like 3 to 6 months should be a requirement as females, because you learn so much about yourself when you do that and get really in tune with your body. And instead of encountering symptoms and being like, how can I suppress this? We're using them as little red flags of things that we could support better, and approaching that with curiosity. And I just felt like when I understood fertility awareness method and used it on myself, I still do to this day, it just gave me so much more connection and power over my health and how I felt. And I think it's something every menstruating female should experience.
Can you imagine if it was taught in schools instead of the terrible sex education that we're currently taught, where they lie to us and say that you can get pregnant any day of the cycle? And that's just fear-mongering. It's not true at all. And that can sometimes make people think that falling pregnant is going to be a super easy thing, because it can happen to anyone at any time. But then they come off the birth control pill and they struggle for 5 years with infertility. When they're age 35, the progesterone levels are starting to decline. What about the kind of devices and things that can be used. Do you recommend any of those? So I use the Daisy thermometer.
Oh yeah, me too. Yep. Love Daisy. It's nice because I would rather that communicate with an app for the basal body temperature portion. And I think it's important that you understand and are paying attention to the other two signs, the cervical position and cervical fluid, in addition to basal body temperature. But I love Daisy. I've been using that for about 5 years and it's user friendly. I love being able to see the graph on an app, and I like the data.
And I agree, using other, not just relying on one, because anything can throw off your temperature. Like if you're getting sick or you drank alcohol the night before, or the room is really hot, like that can that can spike your temperature, and then you might assume that you've ovulated and you've actually not, and then either again not fall pregnant when you want to, fall pregnant when you don't want to. Interesting. And I really like the book Taking Charge of Your Fertility. I'm not sure if there's is there any courses or any, if someone does want to train a little bit more, is there anything that you recommend? Fertility Friday on Instagram, so at Fertility Friday, has a lot of great resources for fertility awareness method training, both free and paid options there. And I typically see her doing free like master classes and stuff on this periodically. So if you're looking for more info, I usually point people to that page. I think it's great. And that book is so great. Lisa Hendricks and Jack. Yeah, she's been on the podcast. I'll link it in the show notes. It was like way at the start. So we did like a full, I think it's like a 90 minutes. She's very generous with her time and education. I know her whole thing is education and just trying to get this information out there, which is amazing. So definitely check out that episode if you're wanting to learn more. So benefits of progesterone, I'm going to cover that in a bit more detail. So you mentioned before, it keeps estrogen or estrogen in check. What do you mean by that, and what other benefits can we expect?
Yeah, so we can think of estrogen as proliferative, so it builds tissue. So as we approach our menstrual cycle, if we didn't get pregnant, of course, and we're getting ready to have a period, the lining and the thickness of the lining of our uterus has a lot to do with the symptoms we might experience at that period. So without progesterone's help, estrogen can grow and proliferate that tissue unchecked. And that's where we tend to have really painful, heavy, or clotty periods. When progesterone's around, it keeps estrogen from doing too much growth, and we have a whole lot less pain, heaviness, and clots with our period. But progesterone does a whole lot more for us than prevent period pain and heavy periods. Like you mentioned back in the beginning, it's nature's anti-anxiety hormone. There's such a big mood connection with progesterone, and it helps with sleep quality. It helps with thyroid function, which is why we see that rise in basal body temperature when progesterone's around. It affects even the way that we utilize different foods for fuel. So we actually use fats a little bit more efficiently when progesterone's around. Affects fluid balance. Like it has a whole lot.
We might as well list like what it doesn't affect.
Right.
like would be one thing. Would be shorter. Yeah. And how do we test progesterone? Or can we just assume if we're getting the signs of ovulation, we're seeing the temperature spike, that our progesterone's good? Like how can we test that?
So I like basal body temperature info to assess the robustness of progesterone production, because I do think it correlates pretty well. If we're seeing that temperature in like the 98s, then we have a pretty good chance that progesterone is looking pretty good. It's not uncommon for the women that I work with low progesterone to have really low basal body temperature in the luteal phase. So even if they're ovulating, we're not making enough progesterone to get that increase in thyroid function. You certainly can test it. So if we're testing progesterone, whether it's blood or whatever form you're using, we need to make sure that that's post-ovulation. Otherwise, it's going to be zero because it's only around if we ovulated. And I can't tell you how many times, even myself earlier on in this journey and past clients have had progesterone labs drawn in their follicular phase. And it's like, that's worthless information because
it's hard enough getting them to agree, especially in the UK, getting them to agree to test. They're like, okay, we'll do progesterone. And then they don't tell you actually when to do it. So then it's a zero and you're like, this was a waste of time.
Yeah, it's silly. So ideally we're doing it around like days 19 or 21 of a 28-day cycle. So a few days post ovulation. So we have a chance to see the progesterone spike going on. There's a company called, and now I'm going to blank on it, but I've tried it. It's like a urine little dipstick that you put in your urine that can assess progesterone levels. It's really not giving you a quantifiable amount of progesterone, more just yes or no about it being present. And it's as a ovulation confirmation tool. But yeah,
there's obviously the more expensive ones like the Dutch test.
Yeah,
which
do
you
love
can
that.
do like the Dutch Complete, which is just a one-off snapshot around days 19 to 21 to see how high or how low your progesterone is, or they do the cycle mapping one, which is good if you're not sure. Are you just catching the spike? So when you do a Dutch test, it's really good. It can be high on that day, but then the very next day it might crash. So the cycle map would show you pretty much every other day from the whole cycle how your estrogen or estrogen is fluctuating. Is it spiking when it should? Is it coming down after ovulation? Is your progesterone kind of doing a nice curve and not falling off a cliff after 3 days of production?
Yeah, the cycle mapping test is a really cool thing just to see that, because otherwise we just don't know what that looks like over the span of that whole phase. We just have that 1 day worth of data unless we do that. So it is very interesting.
And with ovulation, so you will always either have a period or you will fall pregnant after you ovulate, either or, but it's the opposite isn't true. So you can have a period but no ovulation. Could you talk about that, like an anovulatory cycle? What's going on there?
Yeah, so that can happen. And if you are aware of how to track signs and symptoms of ovulation, you'll be aware of this. Typically, that's because some kind of stressful event happened around the time that you were set to ovulate. And that can be life stress. It can be traveling across time zones majorly, messing with your circadian rhythm. It can be getting sick. It can be some kind of a infection or something going on physiologically too. Really, anytime the body does not feel safe, it's going to put the stops on ovulation, because that's one of the things that the body is always deciding is whether or not it's safe to procreate and safe to divert resources to procreation, because that's a very energy dependent process. So if something's going on that's stressing the body out, it's like, hey, let's protect her. We're going to shut this down for the month. Obviously that can continue for many months, and we can talk about some reasons why that might happen. But you can sometimes have a bleed even without ovulation, and it's just the shedding of that lining. But it's not a true period. And you really wouldn't know that it wasn't a true period unless you were tracking signs and symptoms of ovulation.
But the period could be particularly like problematic, that cycle, or extra lengthy, or maybe like spotting beforehand. It may not be like, if it was every month, perfect 28-day cycle, great period, then it's very likely that you are ovulating. So if you have one, like every woman every now and again has a crazy weird period, that's normal, especially if you're crossing time zones and things like that. So that's maybe nothing to worry about. But when it's every single month and the cycle is all over the place, let's talk about some of the causes that you just mentioned. So stress. I like to say that stress isn't just emotional, work, family, all of that. It's having some sort of infection. So could you talk about the stresses that could contribute?
Sure. So like being sick is very much enough to delay or prevent ovulation for that cycle. Having some kind of an underlying infection, whether that's in the gut or somewhere else systemically in the body. Same thing for chronic inflammation. If we're constantly simmering with inflammation, that can be enough to tip the favor toward not safe enough to ovulate. Traveling across time zones is circadian rhythm stress. So our sleep-wake cycle is very much tied to our menstrual cycle too. We've got like our typical day-to-day stress that can add to that, anticipatory stress for the day. So even just like being stressed about the day can be enough to tip us in the favor of stress. Nutrient deficiencies or mineral imbalances can do it too. And I think it's important to just remember how energy dependent the whole process of ovulation is. So if we are underfed, underrested, that can be enough stress on the body that we just don't have the raw materials to move forward with it that month. So there are a lot of things that
what
can,
are some of the common
that.
infections and sources of inflammation that you see with your clients?
Yeah, I see a lot of digestive stuff in my clients. We do a lot of work with that and run like GI map stool tests to take a look at what's going on there. So that can be either a lack of beneficial flora, because that has a lot to do with regulating inflammation and immune function, or it can be the presence of some pathogens, whether that's bacterial, parasitic, yeast, or fungal in the gut. And that's taking resources away from elsewhere in the body, because the immune system is having to put out those fires in the gut. Not to mention what's going on in the gut affects nutrient absorption too. So we have that secondary like depletion aspect of it. And then in inflammation wise, I see a lot of blood sugar issues in my clients. So blood sugar being too high, insulin being too high, chronically, that can be pretty inflammatory. And that alone messes with hormone signaling pretty significantly. I see a lot of issues with
PCOS.
Yeah. Yes. Big connection with PCOS. See a lot of like dietary choices being inflammatory for them too. So it's discussions around food quality and good antioxidants, lots of fruits and veggies in their diet. Even stuff with like iron and other mineral metabolism being out of whack. There's a lot with iron and copper in the women's health space that can be inflammatory too.
And there's even some women like struggle with years of infertility and they have something like celiac disease. So they're eating something every day that is a toxin to them, chronic inflammation, the gut is like working overtime and they're probably running into deficiencies as a result. So just removing gluten. I tend to do that with the majority of my clients just to as an intro like elimination, because most people are sensitive to some degree. But what's your kind of diet philosophy? Obviously it's going to differ person to person, but do you have any like general recommendations?
Sure. First and foremost, we have to be eating enough. And at least with the population that I work with, there's a lot of under eating that's going on, whether it's intentional or not. There's some women that come in and like decades of dieting, and we have to work on that. Or some people are just unaware of how much they need to eat and just accidentally are under fueling. And that's really the foundation of our pyramid when we're looking at food priorities, is making sure that you're well nourished. And then taking it beyond that, I care a lot about blood sugar balance. So within that, eating enough, are we getting a good balance of carbs, proteins, and fats together to keep blood sugar nice and steady? Because if that's swinging high and low all day, that's significantly stressful on the body. Of course, we care about food quality too. So whole real foods as often as possible, lots of good fruits and veggies, quality animal proteins, anti-inflammatory fats. And it is pretty common. I'd say the most common thing I pull out of people's diets is gluten, at least on a temporary basis, to see if that moves the needle for them, because it is so commonly inflammatory. But my goal is always as much variety as possible and to pull out the least amount of foods in order for them to be successful. And there's a time and place for eliminations, but I do try to use that sparingly.
And all progesterone comes from kind of egg health. So improving egg health is absolutely key, and things like environmental toxins, heavy metals, and just kind of free radical damage just from wear and tear as we get older will contribute to lower egg health. But are there any particular nutrients that we can focus on? So you mentioned some deficiencies that can become a problem with iron, but any nutrients that are particularly important for egg health and therefore progesterone?
Yeah, big fans of vitamin C and vitamin E. So those are two really great antioxidants. So preventing that free radical damage you were talking about that can degrade egg health. Vitamin E is also a fat soluble vitamin, so it can help work as a building block for our hormones, since those are all manufactured out of fat. That's an important concept. Zinc, selenium, and iodine are all really important for egg health too. And then I'm a fan for magnesium with like really any women's health thing going on, or any health item in general can usually benefit from some magnesium. So those would be my first line nutrients that I'd be making sure we were not deficient in. Beyond that, there's some herbal things that can be helpful, like Vitex can be a helpful thing short term if somebody's having issues with consistent ovulation. But I'm usually starting with those food foundations and specific nutrients.
Yeah, the micronutrients, minerals are extremely important, but then people overlook the macronutrients. So you mentioned eating enough, but then there's the camp of people who are just like, if it fits your macros, just eat 3,000 calories a day if you need that, but it doesn't really matter where it's coming from. But do you see people particularly overeating any macronutrient or undereating something like carbs?
Yeah. And there's a lot of undereating of carbs going on because we went from like a fat fearing state kind of culturally to carb fearing somewhat recently, like with the popularity of the keto diet, really. So I have a lot of women that are very much scared to eat more than like 50 to 75 grams of carbs in a day. Like that feels scary and like it's too many. But from clinical experience, and I believe it was Dr. Laura Bryden that quantified this originally, about 150 grams of carbs a day for most women is needed for consistent ovulation, because there's a connection between insulin production and the like pituitary hormones that trigger ovulation in the brain. So we do make sure that we're getting enough carbohydrates. There are instances where people are getting too much carbs as well if it's influencing blood sugar. So we may bring that down closer to the 150 range, but that's usually the target that I'm shooting for. And then if somebody is coming from that fat fearing decades of nutrition information, they might be scared to eat enough fats in their diets. And I typically don't like to see women eating less than 50 grams a day, just from like a raw materials to make our steroid sex hormone standpoint. Some need much more than that, but that's a minimum that I'm looking for there.
And that carb threshold makes sense just evolutionarily, and just for women, if there's any scarcity, because carbohydrates are the main source of energy as well for the human body. So if you're maybe eating enough calories, but really underdo it on the carbohydrate side of things, just female brain will be sent into fight and flight mode, because it feels like there's a famine, and the brain, especially with female body, is very sensitive to starvation signals. So even though you're eating enough, if you're not eating enough carbohydrates, then that could be enough to delay ovulation.
Same thing with how you time your eating too, because there are a lot of people that are intermittent fasting. And even though their total calories and maybe even their total macronutrients look okay, delaying that mealtime and extending the fasting time can sometimes, and very oftentimes in my experience, be enough of a stress on the body to mess with ovulation. So the female body wants gentle, consistent nutrition.
Yes, exactly. And it may work amazingly for men. That's why it's kind of been studied for men, and men really get great results, and especially for longevity and things like that, and fat burning. But for women, it seems to do the exact opposite in my experience.
Yeah, it works maybe for a little bit, and then the wheels fall off, and it's not good.
Very true. And what could be happening? So we've mentioned the things that can delay ovulation in the first place. So stress, time zone changes, maybe being deficient in something that could prevent you from ovulating. But what could cause low progesterone, or it's known as a luteal phase defect, short luteal phase. So you might ovulate, you might get a good amount of progesterone, but some people it only lasts 5 to 7 days, which isn't healthy. Ideally, it should be minimum 10, I'd say, ideally 12 to 14.
Yeah, agreed. It's a very similar list of things that could cause that, because it's, again, a safety issue, like the brain detecting whether or not we're safe, and a raw materials issue. So if there's significant stress from all of the different things that we already discussed, we're diverting resources away from progesterone production and toward those other things. So we're still going to troubleshoot, are we eating enough and of the right balance for that individual? Are we eating consistently throughout the day? Are we hitting, consistent sleep wake times and taking care of that circadian rhythm? Are we overlooking nutrient deficiencies in vitamins or minerals that are needed to make progesterone? Is there something going on with the thyroid that we need to investigate? Something going on with the gut? So really anything that's applying stress to the body can sabotage progesterone production.
So it's just that the corpus luteum that's producing progesterone, and therefore the egg that it came from, is just weak and isn't kind of living for as long as it should do.
Right. And it needs, so that's something that needs good blood flow. It needs antioxidant protection from free radical damage. And we also need to make sure that the brain ovary communication is going well too. And that's particularly important for people coming off birth control. And I think that that's a big reason why progesterone production has such a lag time after we come off birth control, is we sever that brain ovary communication while we take synthetic pills, synthetic hormones, I should say. And depending on how long you've been on it, the brain and the ovaries haven't really had a chance to catch up in a long time. So you pull the hormonal contraceptive out, but it's like they have to almost get acquainted again to get things sorted out. And that was something that took a long time for me, because I went on birth control so shortly after ever getting a period that I didn't even have a chance to normalize progesterone production on my own first. So just remembering that the brain is really calling the shots with the ovaries. So, taking care of that brain is absolutely part of this conversation too.
I think it was in Laura Brydon's book as well that she said, from the start of your very first period, it takes about 7 years for that brain and ovary connection to really kind of to fit together. So if you interfere and you start birth control 2 years in, it's kind of like you have to restart at that point again once you come off the birth control. So that's why it can take. It took me 2 years to get my period back after the pill. There were other gut infections, and I was underweight because of my digestion at the time, so there was other things at play. But some women, they get the period back right away, which is amazing. Sometimes they fall pregnant, which may not be the best because your body is already in a state of depletion, but these things can happen. But it can be anywhere from like 3 months to 2 years sometimes with some of my clients. Interestingly, with the antioxidant protection and the corpus luteum, I once attended a talk that Dr. Carrie Jones did. She came to the UK, so she's like the hormone queen, and she gave a really interesting kind of like golden nugget, and it was to increase your intake of carotenoids, because they feed the corpus luteum. So the Latin, I think, term for corpus luteum is yellow body, and these carotenoid rich foods, so the yellows, orange, greens, pink, like plant pigments in things like oranges, sweet potato, carrots. They directly feed the carotenoids in the corpus luteum. So introducing and increasing your foods around the luteal phase, but pretty much the whole cycle, could increase your progesterone. So that's great.
It's like literally never a bad idea to add more colorful produce.
That is very true. But is there anything that could happen? So let's say someone ovulated, everything's going fine, no underlying health conditions. Could there be a stress in the luteal phase that just triggers the period?
Yeah, so you can have something like a stressful event shortening that luteal phase. And again, it's a matter of stress and taking resources away. And if we can't sustain that progesterone production, then that's what's going to trigger the bleed, because progesterone is really what's maintaining the stability of the endometrial lining. So once that starts to decline, we have like a crumbling basically of that lining and the start of the bleed. So it can come early. Basically anything could go on in that time frame and change the day that your period would be happening.
Yeah, it's a very protective mechanism. So anyone who's listening who's struggling with this, maybe miscarriage or struggling to get pregnant or is having low progesterone symptoms, it's not that your body is doing this to be annoying, to kind of ruin your life. It's because it's protecting you. Your body probably doesn't have enough resources for its own health, and it doesn't feel like at this moment in time it has the nutrients or energy to pass on to a new life.
Yep. And then that's always the question of
reduce stress and anxiety.
Yeah. And the question to come back to is always, where is my body not feeling safe? Like, where can I be better supporting myself, or what do I need to investigate? Because there's always a reason for that.
And a great mantra, I tell a lot of my female clients, a great mantra is I am safe. Just as a woman, that is either saying it out loud or just in your head, honestly, can make the biggest difference, because that's all that our body is just detecting and scanning all day, every day, either real or perceived stress. So I'm safe. I'm saying that all day long inside my head. I would love to know your thoughts on bioidenticals. So you've just given us all of the benefits of progesterone, and we discussed how the progestins in birth control are synthetic and aren't the same. But what about something like bioidentical progesterone? So if someone is really struggling with ovulation, they're trying to work on the root causes, but just for some symptom relief, do you often find that it can be helpful, or is there anything else that we need to know about it?
Yeah, I definitely have had clients in which that's been helpful for just helping them feel good enough to be able to implement a lot of the root cause work, because sometimes when progesterone is really low, those symptoms are so severe that it's difficult to do the work that it's going to take to get out of that situation. So I do think in the right scenario, as long as it's bioidentical, it can be a helpful tool. It's not something that I prescribe personally, but normally I'll partner with their OBGYN and have these conversations. I've also had some clients that needed that assistance during early pregnancy too, as decided by their OBGYN, and have seen it useful in that instance as well. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of going to that first, because I think that there's a lot of work and a lot of improvements that can be made with all the lifestyle stuff that we talked about. But if somebody is either so symptomatic that it's hard to execute the lifestyle stuff, or it's just taking a very long time to get that symptom relief, I think it can be a helpful tool.
Totally agree. And it is a bit of a band-aid solution, but it can just get you by and just help you not feel like a different person for the second half of your cycle. But I remember when I took it, because I was getting some PMS, not knowing at the time that I had parasites and mold illness and all of these gut infections. So it was more of the yam creams, just the ones that you can get over the counter and things, that I tried, and it actually made my PMS a million times worse. My breasts were so swollen and tender, my acne kind of blew up, and it's because my body was so inflamed. I was just throwing more hormones into it that it just got worse. So be mindful, if you are using it, work on the root cause.
For sure, because it does sensitize estrogen receptors too. So if there is estrogen dominance going on, or we're releasing estrogen from tissues, it's going to make that worse, at least initially. So it can't be the only thing that you're doing and expect to feel better.
Yeah, so it's definitely estrogen dominance going on.
Yeah.
So to finish up, I think we've covered everything, unless there's anything else you want to mention about ovulation. I think we've covered it all, the most important parts. And I'm sure we could chat all day about women's health and everything, but I always end my interviews with a few questions from my guests. So we'll do that now. The first one is, what's something that you do daily to stay in hormonal harmony?
Oh, that is get outside. That is time and time again the thing that makes the biggest impact for me. And when I'm getting stressed or low energy or in a bad mood, it's usually because I haven't been outside. So even if it's like 2 minutes, just step out there, things are better. Yeah. Seeing the sun is very much connected. So
yeah, a lot of people have magnesium deficiency, but I think maybe similar people have a nature deficiency.
Yes,
as well.
I love that.
Getting that sunlight in your eyes, especially in the morning time,
Yeah.
can help with your menstrual cycle, because we're very influenced by the sun and the moon, the light and the dark cycles, as you were saying before, with the people being kind of synced with the moon. You won't be doing that if you're on the birth control, but that's just another cool thing that happens when you're in sync with not only your body, but also the world.
Yeah.
Book recommendations. So we've mentioned the Taking Charge of Your Fertility. So that would be my recommendation from the episode. Any other like women's health, hormone, geeky books that you want to share?
Yeah, I think Laura Brydon's Period Repair Manual should be required reading too.
Love that one.
It's really well written, and I think a great intro to all things female body, but big fan of Taking Charge of Your Fertility too. I think both of those together in good shape.
And Laura Brydon's, it's kind of just find your issue, find the solution. So it's really easy to read. What's one thing that you couldn't live without? So this could be a food, a supplement, an appliance, a gadget.
Yeah, that's tough. I feel like there are a lot of things. Dark chocolate brings me a lot of joy. And my other thing that was coming to mind was magnesium, and you get that from dark chocolate too. So we're just going to combine them.
Both benefits. Tastes good and it helps, especially during the PMS phase. Actually, scientifically shown. So get your dark chocolate.
See, we're smart. The body knows what it needs.
Exactly. So final question is, where can people find you online? So you're amazing on social media. You're one of my favorite people to follow. But also if someone's wanting to work with you, how can they find you online?
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram. It's at Kaely RD. My name is spelled weird. It's Kaely. And that's where I spend most of my time and do a lot of like educating and stuff on Instagram. I really enjoy it. And my website is the same. It's KaelyRD.com. And you can find info about working with me and my team on both of those places. So yeah, I would love to say hello to you guys on Instagram if you've listened.
Perfect. Yeah, if you've liked this episode, you not only talk about ovulation and progesterone, but a ton of other things as well. So yeah, if you like this podcast, if you like my stuff, you will definitely like Kaely's as well. So I will link those in the episode show notes. So yeah, I wanted to thank you so much for chatting with me today. This has been really fun. As I said, I would chat to you all day, every day. And I love having practitioners who follow kind of same root cause, not just band-aiding the issue and helping these women who are really struggling. And I feel like when you've been through your own struggles, it actually makes you a better practitioner. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. And I've loved connecting with you, Kaely.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad we connected too. And I just love the work that you're putting out there and the community that you've created, because this is really important work. So thanks for letting me hang out.
Thank you so much.